What are the forces, challenges, and ideas that define the 21st century? Conversations to understand the greatest figures and stories of today to create a better tomorrow. This is the 21st Talks podcast. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the 21st Talks podcast with me, Coleman. Today, I'm interviewing the wonderful Dr. Dickson Despommier. He was a professor at the University of Columbia in microbiology and public health from 1971 to 2009. He is now a professor of public health at Fordham University in New York. And he is also a TEDx speaker, a author of the 2010 book Vertical Farming, which had massive positive feedback and reviews. And he is also a major player in the vertical farming industry. He knows a lot of people, and he has gone to influence the field in a way that's hard to specifically measure, but is still apparent. We talk about vertical farming, the role of human agriculture in public health, as well as a little bit about the history of parasites. That is his formal background, and he's really gone to expand his own education long into his academic career in a way that is really notable. And he has strived to identify the problems facing our species and how we can build a more sustainable, more healthy, and truly more nourished world. This episode is a little bit longer than usual, so feel free to show us some love in the comments and review sections on Spotify or Apple Podcast or wherever you're listening to this podcast on. It really goes to enhance what we're able to do, and the feedback is critical to the growth of this podcast. Before jumping right into the interview with Dr. Dickson Despommier, I want to give a quick word to something that I think is it's a bit of housekeeping, a bit of intellectual housekeeping for this podcast. I feel that discussions like this are ethical in results. They produce a revision of what concepts, beliefs, and ideas I go into it with, what research I have done, and the inaccuracies that they hold. Because of that, any inaccuracies in the podcast or what I say, I try to edit out. I try to really ensure that what I'm saying is truthful and what is getting out there is factual, relates to what is true. However, there's still a lot of speculation in these podcasts. There's still a lot of questions that might be skewed one way or another, and know that the central tenet of this podcast is that critical discussions are critical to the growth of our ability as intellectuals or our ability as thinkers to actually understand the forces going on in our world today. My guests help me understand what's going on. My guests paint a picture of a specific nuanced way of viewing the world and explanation for things. They're accountants, but with the best numbers possible. The numbers of forces and ideas that empower, drive, and shift the world ahead. It's that same emphasis on truth and critical discussion being an ethical way to revise the bad beliefs present in all of us is going to maintain as true for this podcast. Going forward, we're going to start tackling some really serious political topics and questions. It's going to become a little bit more political during this election cycle. So far, a lot of the episodes have worked on the level of existential risks or philosophy or a cross-section of the two. And we talk about topics that are really serious. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a true 21st century talk, right? If it was just diverting. Well, although I take that back, actually, that would be very, very on brand for this century. Talking about things that don't actually matter and framing them as important is not an unknown tactic for our political system. But nonetheless, this podcast is not a politician's wet dream. This podcast is about understanding what is true and understanding what is actually influential in the coming century for the individual and for our world as a whole. And because of that, I can't ignore politics. I don't want to ignore politics. And as soon as you jump in the realm of politics, you open yourself up to inherent bias that you have that's present in everything, but especially is exacerbated in the realm of modern U.S. politics. So the same critical eye that I bring to any of these topics will still be applied to those. And I hope that through the episodes that I produce, we're able to learn something new about some of the specific challenges facing our democracy today, because it is really, really important that we are able to understand and learn where to guide the democratic processes here in the US and around the world, because in a lot of ways they're failing right now. And the system is about to get inundated with a lot of risks and problems. They're the byproduct of climate change and things that we talk about in today's episode with Dickson Despommier. And it is a little bit challenging to overcome those when you have a democracy so beset by a war against democratic principles. And I think that's bad. I don't think I'm going out on a limb there saying that's a bad thing. But nonetheless, this is just one long way of saying that as we become more political in topics of choice, that the same mission for truth and a lack of bias is still going to be critical there. The goal, again, is to understand what is and not just what seems to be. But thank you guys very much for listening to this, and I'm excited to bring this episode with Dr. Dickson Despommier to you all. But here is, without any further ado now, episode 4 of the 21st Talks podcast with Dr. Dickson Despommier. Thank you guys very much. We can just go ahead and jump straight into it. What has it been like, as someone who knows so much about the history of virology, to witness an epidemic unfold?
Well, that's when I was your age, or even a little bit younger, actually, around 11 years old, my family moved from California to New Jersey. And that was in 1951. So if you think back to 1951, what was the big plague of the world in 1951? And the answer is polio. So polio was unknown as to what it was caused by. They had no idea of how you caught it. And when we moved to my little town of Dumont, New Jersey actually had a swimming pool. It was a public pool, had a little fake sand beach, had a high diving board, a low diving board. Lots of kids used to go there in the summer. And my first year there, I was in heaven. The next year, they closed the pool, because by then they found out that it was a fecally transmitted disease. And believe it or not, some people actually use the swimming pool as their toilet, especially under the age of 2 years old. And so polio virus started to be a big deal. And that was the biggest scourge of the 1950s. So I grew up knowing that, and the vaccine and the culture of the virus and the identification of its genome, all of that occurred in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I now podcast with a guy by the name of Vincent Racaniello, he's a real virologist. I just go along for the show. I'm a parasitologist, but I'm not a virologist. But Vincent Racaniello actually worked with David Baltimore on sequencing the entire genome of the polio virus. And then from scratch, they made the virus. They constructed the genome in the laboratory based on the sequence that they determined from sequencing the polio virus. And it worked. They infected cells. The cells got sick. They died. They could make a vaccine from that if they wanted. So they fully understood the way this virus worked for the first time.
When were they reconstructing?
That's 1970s and 1980s.
Wow, that early.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Since then, since we learned how to sequence faster than a speeding bullet, basically. And you've got a big institute at the University of Washington.
Yeah.
That's funded by NIH and by lots of other sources that actually invented sequencing. And now you can get your whole genome sequenced for less than $1,000. That's ridiculous. To go that far in that short a time. And I think the idea is, of course, that in the next 10 years, we'll have sequenced every living thing. Right. So we'll find out what our true place in the universe is once we do that. And I'm sure we're going to be disappointed when we do. So we're not the center of that universe.
Nine more.
We just think we are. And this
Mm.
virus is certainly proving that, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's showing that we're not at the top of the food chain. You know, there's nothing that's inherently leaning towards humanity and any way whatsoever being sort of some magnum opus of nature. There are other things that we are still competing with, and I
That's right.
think modernity has kind of put a veil over our eyes of our actual vulnerability, right?
You're
Which I
right.
think is something that I'd be really interested in diving into with you, since you come from a public health background. Is what are these massive health challenges we're facing in addition to starvation and actually now in a lot of ways obesity as well, which is a really weird pendulum to be on.
True.
um are we going to continue to see different viruses pop up, or parasites popping up, and what does it tell us about our place in nature?
Of course. So we are nature. All
Mm,
right. So people think that we're not because we create these barriers between us and the rest of the world.
yeah.
Namely, the house that you're sitting in, the house I'm in, school has nothing to do with nature whatsoever. You get a job on Wall Street or you get a job in a vertical farm, even. It's still
Mhm,
got nothing to do with the way nature really behaves. So, very few people actually understand the processes that are at work to make nature what it is. Okay, so nature is basically a melange of millions and millions of different living organisms, all living together, all competing for various resources like air, water, nutritional elements like amino acids or sugars or whatever have you.
mhm,
And a balance is achieved by the parasites that infect all of those living forms. And they range from viruses to protozoans to fungi to bacteria to worms to even some arthropods. So you've got these checks and balances on you can't have too many of this because you've got more of those. As soon as you create a monocrop of something, like a whole bunch of people living in a city,
yeah.
and they all love to go to the bars, or they like to go out to the beach, or they like to go sailing in massive amounts of numbers, and they like to kiss and hug and greet and all these other human things. Well, there
Mhm,
are viruses out there, and there are other organisms too that will take advantage of that as a way
mhm.
of spreading from one host to the next.
Which we saw that historically when it came to, one of the reasons why uh diseases like massive epidemics were much more common in the old world, where people were in close proximity, were
Sure.
living in really major cities, but were in close proximity to animals. So those
Yeah.
those diseases
Be
were
like
able
rats.
exactly, yeah, exactly. Whereas in the new world there wasn't that same intimacy with
That's
animals. Hopefully not literally.
that's right. But if it hadn't been for Genghis Khan and his band of merry men and his women too. In fact, his
Famously very
entire
nice.
entourage, they didn't live in any particular place. They moved their entire cities. It was like a mobile city.
Yeah.
The moment they crossed over into Europe, then they got chased back, by the way, okay? But they left their garbage. And all of the animals from the steppes of, let's say, Tibet and China, they followed the garbage and they fed on the garbage and they grew in population. And of course, they also contained this little bacterium that we call plague, and the fleas were every place. So the moment the people left, the fleas had to go to some other animal, so they went to the rats. And the rats were all over Europe because, what did we know about managing garbage? We learned that from the Romans that used to throw it out in the streets at night, right? So the fact is that we ended up creating a perfect storm for the introduction of a microbe,
Mm.
which altered the entire course of history.
Well, how do
And
we? Oh, sorry.
no, I was just going to say we had three waves of that.
Oh,
The
really?
first wave killed off about a third of Europe.
Hmm.
The second wave, which happened about 50 years later, killed off about 20% of Europe. And the next wave that came along killed off about 2% of Europe. And what happened was the survivors that were immune by natural selection repopulated those areas. And the next thing you know, that infection is no longer valid because, to be honest, we're immune already because our immune system kicked in and said, you're going to survive, but a whole bunch is going to die first.
Mm.
And that's basically the way life works on all other levels. It works for bacteria infected with viruses. It works for helminths infected with bacteria and viruses, and fungi also. So the control of populations is largely due to the fact that there are parasites which take advantage of the fact that once too many of one thing grows up, there's something to counteract that. That's a crop for them.
So I keep hearing you use a term relating to like the idea of there being like monoculture or mono something,
Yes, yes.
a single of something, and is that why that idea is so important? Is when you have one species or one crop or like one system of society, it creates the perfect environment for parasites to take advantage of that
No question.
stagnation.
No question. So the saying that I love to repeat to my students when I used to teach
Mhm.
is that parasites take advantage of successful systems.
Wow.
So we
Yeah.
are a successful system, and very successful. There are 7.8 billion of us right now.
Yeah.
Well, that's not going to last. I mean, that can't go on forever.
Well, so it seems like the stability of society in this specific way is actually a deficit. You know,
Yeah.
it's the stability of society creates the perfect recipe for these terrible parasites to come in and wipe us
Well,
out.
right.
And
Yeah,
I think
because we keep
my
forgetting that we're part of nature.
Yeah, exactly. And so we have this false dichotomy in our head of us versus nature. We are not nature. We are the observers of nature. We're this conscious entity that's able to actually, there's a default object subject division there that isn't actually accurate. And that's fascinating that it comes down to creating the perfect recipe for these parasites. So I think my question is, when it comes to if parasites are inevitable, right? Can
They are.
technology and
They're not
science
acceptable. They're essential.
uh, fair. If they are essential, is there a way to stay ahead of them? Can our technology, can our science allow us to actually stay in a position where the majority of our species or a third of our species or 50% of our species isn't dying out on a semi regular basis every couple hundred years from these parasites? Is our
Yeah,
technology going to
it's
give
a
us
great question
utility?
because we think we're the only species that has insight into our future. Right? We have consciousness and we can
Yeah.
predict the future based on observing the past.
Hmm.
Other animals, like let's say a gazelle living on the Serengeti plains of Africa, that gets chased down by a cheetah and comes within an inch of its life of dying, the moment that doesn't happen, it goes back to eating. I mean, it's like that didn't happen. Or if I don't keep eating, I'm not going to have enough energy. And the next time a cheetah chases me, I'm going to get caught. So I'm going to have to, just live in the moment. We don't live in the moment. We live in the future. We think about what will happen to me 10 years from now, or 5 years from now, or 20 years from now. Eventually, of course, we're all going to die, but no one really comes to grips with that right away. It's a tough concept because we don't want to accept it. But if things didn't die, there wouldn't be nature. There
Hmm.
wouldn't be a mechanism for recycling. So you have to include birth, life, and death for every single living thing on the planet, including us. Okay, so we're no exceptions to this. And the only way to avoid this is if we could somehow cesareanly section and deliver people sterilely into an incubator and then ship it off to, like, say, the moon where there are no microbes and let that person or people grow up in the absence of microbial life.
Hmm.
If we could do that, then those people would grow up disease free in terms of microbes. They may die from the lack of microbes, however, because some of those microbes are good. Some
Hmm.
of them provide vitamins, like E. coli in our gut tract provides vitamin K. Without vitamin K, you won't clot your blood.
Wow.
Ha! Who the hell knew that? Well, you just read a book.
So some parasites are reciprocal then. It's not just
Well,
all
let's
germs,
put it.
bacteria, or perhaps not parasites, but bacteria generally, because I mean, the good gut bacteria that
Yeah,
is a big
yeah, yeah.
health fad. So And it seems to me that there isn't really a way to distinguish good bacteria from bad bacteria, because good bacteria will inevitably evolve to fit a new niche, even if it's within our own human populations of
Here,
like
here,
stomachs.
here. And that's what we think they all became. They were all bad guys to begin with. And by natural selection, with regards to the more broadly based immune system that we inherited from our parents, we were able to resist on a natural level, which had nothing to do with our exposure to that organism, but just by luck, some antibody molecule was selected to resist that particular microbe. And then the microbe says, well, what the hell, as long as I'm here, I might as well grow up. And, oh, by the way, I make vitamin K in case you need that. And I can also, imagine what life would be like if you ate all your food and you sat down that night and went to bed. The next morning, when you thought you had to take a bowel movement, you had no possibility for that because you had no gut tract infection. And all those microbes don't exist. Now, instead of producing something that we have vile terms for, but it's what's left after all of our food has been digested, we've converted that to something that's easy to get rid of. Try to get rid of something that's not digested, and you'll see. It's either going to come out your oral cavity or you'll have one hell of a time the next morning trying to defecate. So microbes are absolutely essential for making our life as pleasant as possible, just from that perspective. And yet we call it, it's a piece of shit. You're shitty this, shitty that. You know what? When that shit, you die. You really do. So you need whatever you've got now. You need whatever you've got now. You need, and so that's interesting, I think.
Yeah, no, that's super fascinating. And if this is our current perspective on viruses and parasites, if this is like widely kind of what a lot of the scientific community kind of responds to and thinks about and sort of contextualizes diseases within, historically, how have other populations who have endured essentially the apocalypse, if 2/3 of everyone died, I study existential risk and global catastrophic risk, and one of the most enlivening things to remember when you're studying these things is that world disasters have happened before and have killed massive swaths of the population. Societies have crumbled in the past.
You bet.
So when that was happening, if it's not currently happening right now or beginning to, how did people generally respond? Like what was the perspective of viruses? Was it just some religious incantation of their sins? Like, how has that changed throughout history?
I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think that without knowledge, you invent knowledge. Okay, you invent a sort of a deus ex machina. Where you're hoping that something will come in and rescue you from all of this because you're worthy of being rescued. Okay, so the Greeks certainly had that as their concept, but a lot of other cultures too that appear to be primitive, but actually they're really quite complex because they've had to navigate all of these disease states and birth defects and an animal attacking you and killing you off randomly. None of that's random. That's all programmed, right? So in the beginning, and we're going to segue into food production too, because when you grow food in the ground, you're essentially throwing yourself on the ground yourself and begging nature to be kind to you, because you're not doing much else to help it along. I mean, you've got the seeds, you put it in the ground, you put a little water and fertilizer in there, and the rest of that is up to whatever happens outside.
So when you're placing your survival in the hands of Mother Nature in a much more sort of, I guess, much less robust way than the hunter-gatherers, maybe that creates a deification of nature, right?
Correct.
Because you have to start worshiping and you have to start justifying why you're going to survive and why it's not just chance, because it's very easy for us to have the perspective, like what did Einstein say about the universe? God doesn't gamble with the universe. If nature gambles with our lives, if we're gambling our lives when we rely on nature, of course people are going to want explanations that make it feel like it's actually a fair barter.
That's right. That's right. If you do the right thing, everything will be fine. So that means in the old days when things didn't go well, like when the climate changed, or when it rained too much, or when it got too warm, or when a locust epidemic came through and ate everything, then somebody in that community did something really heinous. And so we're going to find out who that is. And when we do, we're going to kill them. And when we do, next year, everything will be fine. So there are cultures that actually survived for a very long time with that as their premise, is that we don't know why our crops succeeded, except that we didn't offend the gods. And the moment we did offend the gods, everything went sour. So we're going to have to kill off a few hundred people or a few people or lots of animals. We're going to have to sacrifice something to the gods. Now imagine being a god looking down and saying, what the hell are those things doing down there? They're killing each other and killing their animals. That's not the way things work. Come on now. Basically, to not know that natural selection is at work for all of these random acts of tragedy, okay, especially raising food, because that's a relatively new thing in our lives. I mean, we've been around for 300,000 years. We've only been raising food for the last 12,000 years. That's nothing. It's a little minuscule portion of our life. And during that time, of course, everything came to fruition, like music, language, mathematics, the calendar, religions. I mean, I'm convinced that if we hadn't invented agriculture, then none of this would have existed. We would have still been hunting and gathering, basically, and we would be what we would call a remnant species.
How has so if disease was seen as something that was a plight of God, right? Because I mean, if
Sure.
just like reading
an act of God, they're still using that phrase. It's built into the Constitution.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay?
Yeah, and it's also
you can't blame bad weather on an act of God. Why would God, for instance, pick out the American Midwest, not India and China and Russia and all these other places too? No, just that one place. I remember when the Dust Bowl existed. Well, I don't remember it per se because I was alive, but I remember reading a lot of literature on it. And one of the very interesting pieces that I read was that at one point, about 600,000 people decided to pray as one. And they prayed for rain. And they prayed routinely. And they prayed continuously. And no rain came. You might want to use that as a minor proof that God does not exist. Now, I don't say that because I think we'll all find out when we die. But before that, these people firmly believed that if you prayed enough and long enough, you could reverse the natural process of things. And so that obviously didn't happen. So 3 million people migrated out of that area over about a 10-year period. Are we running out of time?
No, we aren't. Just want to know if I was in class.
So, I mean, I think that when you start to put in context all of these rationalizations, okay, they're rationalizations for what's really happening. Once we found out what's really happening, well, then it's easy. All you have to do is grow your food indoors. That's a simple deal. That's absolutely stupid simple. And it took from 1700 to the present to actually perfect that idea. And here we find ourselves now on the doorstep of, you don't have to have crop failures every year. You don't have to feed the locust instead of people. You don't have to actually do any of that if you really want food, and if you really want everybody to eat. And that's a big if, because I'm sure that there are some political groups that believe that there should be just distances between various groups in order to create the tension of creativity or economics or even to justify their religion. It varies with every culture, but they don't believe it. I don't know one culture that thinks that everybody is absolutely the same and equal. Although our Constitution says so. It was written by people who owned slaves.
Yeah, 25 of the 55.
I mean, come on, give me a break. And we never taught that in school because that would be like heresy.
Well, I mean, traditionally, like shifting more so to a focus on vertical farming explicitly. So are you saying that you see vertical farming as a potential route to sort of equalizing a lot of the disparities in society? Because I mean, when you allow, essentially it's a new form of control over our world, right? Instead of having just one crop cycle a year, you can have three or four inside. I know in another interview you did, I forget with what outlet, you said that if a crop failure happens one day, you can start planting the next. You don't have to wait
That's
till
true.
the next
No,
season
you're
start
absolutely
growing.
right.
So
Yeah,
it seems like the solution's not necessarily less control, but it's a different type of control. It's
yes,
bringing it under our own roof, So
that's
instead
correct.
of it being we need to worship nature and play this game of randomness, we have the
Right, we do.
faculties to control it more precisely and more
We do.
intelligently.
This is exactly right. I mean, it's the same as everything else in our lives. I mean, look around you and all the technological gadgetry that you're surrounded by, right? Me
Mm,
too. All that stuff came about as a result of science, every
mm,
bit of it. And yet we have half of this population in this country are science deniers, except, of course, for the things that enable their life to proceed, like television, like nitrate-loaded hot dogs, and all kinds of other stuff that you and I take for granted and say, well, maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, but these people say, no, no, science, no, it's awful stuff. We don't like that. We believe in whatever the Bible says. That's what we believe, but that's not. They're actually hypocrites.
or we,
They
we
don't
we
believe that at
believe in
all because it,
science. We believe in science insofar as it doesn't usurp what this holy scripture says, right? Which
correct.
is like, which
That's
is
correct.
a very problematic way of going through life. When the scientific revolution, if you can actually call it a revolution, what was actually being revolutionized was not necessarily truth itself, but the authority for truth. Instead of it being
Sure,
Aristotle and the Bible,
sure,
it
sure.
became empirical evidence, which allows us to actually overcome the sort of routine barrier in human society.
So
This
you're correct.
issue of not progressing. Because when you had a crop failure in the 14th century, you're some poor farmer in France, you're not gonna go like, oh well, maybe I should just have a slightly better agricultural system, better dike system, something with that. Although those things might evolve naturally over time, what you do is you go to the priest and ask why this happened. What
Of
sins
course.
can I relieve myself of,
You
right?
bet.
So, which is fascinating. And it seems like it's happening now.
Even
Perhaps
more so.
you think so.
I do because I mean, people cherry pick the concepts that don't interfere with their lives,
True.
and the ones that do, like for instance, let's go to. I had a dean at our School of Public Health at Columbia University, of all places, right? That said that whatever the Pope is advocating right now is absolutely wrong because he's really telling people to have more people, okay?
Yeah.
Because he just wants more Catholics, basically. That's
Mm.
the concept. But so I gave the lecture after he did. So I came in and I said, well, let's examine that just for about 5 minutes, okay? Um, the country that's most Catholic in Europe is Italy. The next most Catholic country in Europe is France.
Mm.
Now, when you look at the birth rates of France and Italy, it's in negative growth.
Yeah.
So, but those are all good Catholics. So they
Mm.
cherry picked every Catholic tenet except one, and that's birth control. So I
I'm
said,
sure divorce as well.
no, that's right. So, but they have the option because they're wealthy or middle class. They
Mm,
read, they're literate. But if you go to Latin America and South America, where
yeah.
the literacy rates are less and people
Mm,
are more likely to believe what they're told from their local priest,
mm,
and the priest says, this is what the Bible says and this is what we should do, that's where the birth rates are highest. The moment literacy creeps into the equation and you have more educated people, the birth rate drops.
mm,
Everybody wants a widescreen television. They don't want two more kids. So we cherry pick our ideas to fit our own personal ends. And
mm.
you can divide this country up into several hundred different subgroups. I mean, we have lots of choices here, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we do.
But the one thing you can't deny is that everybody needs to eat.
Yeah, it's the great, universal. We all have to eat,
Right.
sleep, and
So,
have some level
but
of
if you know
community.
that everybody needs to eat, why do we charge money for food
Mm,
if they have to eat? Now, if they didn't have to eat, if they just thought they needed to eat, Okay, well, we're going to charge you for that. But if you have to eat and you still can't afford to pay for it, there's very little sympathy for those people. And that's really the main crux of the argument. Why can't we treat everybody the same when it comes to water, food, air, clothing, housing? After
Yeah.
that, you're on your own. You're on your own after that, okay? But prior to that, you're a goddamn human being. You're not an automaton, or you're not some subhuman type thing that you can use as a slave, for instance. When you, it's just an important mindset that
Yeah.
says that there's an economics
Yeah, which is
eating,
precisely
to
what it is.
drinking, and to breathing.
Yeah,
But
well,
there's no economics to that whatsoever. Just know that there's no economics.
it's
It's a biological imperative.
it's a set of ideas that are not natural, but it's understandable why we have come to this place in society where the idea that you have to pay for these essentials of life it's so embedded because of just kind of the teleology and the natural direction of our economic system, right? When you
Oh,
tell
no, of
everyone
course, of course.
commodity and consumption is this end all be all, the thing that will fill the void deep in your heart, when it's actually what will is love, kindness, and community, as well as a sense of personal meaning. When we tell people that it's just these material ends will fill those things, people invest in that, people embody that. Broken
Of
people
course.
then are developed, and that ramps up the amount of consumption, which then just kind of accelerates the entire process.
No, you're
So
right.
it's understandable we're there. And it's interesting because I haven't ever thought about vertical farming as a direct solution, or at least in some way a foundational block to the larger solution of making a more fair, truly fair world where people have everything provided for them that they bare essentially need. And I think one of the things that I find really, really interesting about vertical farming is the potential for community oriented vertical farms, right?
Here, here.
Because I know free market vertical farms, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and obviously in the U.S. and global North, the private sector has very large influence in actual development of technology, right?
Okay.
It was that, then like NASA and NASA's budgets like cuts, and maybe the military, but the military is not going to invest in vertical farming because they're and still in this human war mindset instead of human survival mindset. But nonetheless, where do you see vertical farming going in relation to community orientation, in relation to meeting the central needs that we have as individuals for community? Do you see any prospects there?
Of course I do.
Then
How
that's
much
why I like
embarrassing
talking to
we
you.
have? No, I can tell you um, that since this idea arose, and it arose in a class that I taught to school public health students. I only had 7 students, and this idea actually arose in that class.
Really? Okay.
And there were 10 years worth of history of this class where students had input on the same idea for 10 consecutive years. So that was really interesting. Now, there's an article that was written in the New Yorker um, by Ian Fraser that I can recommend to your listeners. And all they have to do is type out New Yorker vertical farm, and they'll get the article. And it was a very nicely written article. And Ian and I sat in my apartment and we talked about how much we like trout fishing and stuff like this.
Always has to
We
trout.
didn't even talk about it for 3 hours, right? And so then we talked about it. And the idea was that these are students that are imagining the future the way they want it, not the way it will be.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
that's the secret to freeing up people's minds to allow them to express the ideas that they really feel inside. In other words, if you ask everybody in the class to write down a 2-page essay on how do you think the world will look 100 years from now, you're going to get some really very depressing answers.
Yeah, it's
Because
easy.
they just see doom and gloom and doom and gloom and doom and gloom. And I do this every year because I still teach over at Fordham University. And I say, okay, you've written that essay. Now let's read it to each other. And everybody reads their essay. And I have 12 students this time. So they all read their essays and they look at each other and says, did you actually write that? Because that's what I wrote, And then everybody was writing basically the same depressing, if things continue the way they are, that's just going to get worse. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So now go home. Next week, I want a 2-page essay on how would you like the world to be 100 years from now? And the essays that I got will just make you cry because these essays are so hopeful and so filled with, someday we may wake up and realize what we're doing to each other and just stop doing it. And if we did that, then what would the world look like? Okay, so fine. So that's the answer I'm going to give you. I mean, if you ask me where I think vertical farming is going, I won't answer that question. But if you ask me where I would like vertical farming to go, I would happily answer the question. And it's very simple and very direct. And you're living in an area of the world where this is a major new source of designing cities.
Yeah.
Okay, there's something called cross-laminated timber. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. If you haven't, you are in for a treat. Cross-laminated timber. And this doesn't sound like it relates to this question at all, but it does. Well, because for about a century now, we've been building buildings out of concrete, steel, and glass. Those three things, right? Concrete is a negative carbon source because you have to blow off the CO2 from limestone in order to create lime, which then is the glue for whatever else you're going to mix it with. And then you throw the water in there. And the next thing you know, if you don't hurry up in 6 hours, it's all going to harden up. And it will never unharden. And we learned that from the Romans.
Yeah.
We've still got structures standing today that the Romans built 2,000 years ago. That's remarkable. Okay, but it's destructive for the environment. It's awful stuff. Concrete is the worst thing you could possibly make anything out of if you have an alternative. Okay? So we have an alternative, and the alternative is wood, but not the kind of wood that you would imagine wooden houses being made out of back in the 1900s or 1800s, or because those things burn down. I mean, you got fires not far away from you right now.
Yeah.
California, so many fires, they don't know what to do with them.
We have one 8 miles away. Yeah.
I know that. So take a look. Take a look at the areas after the fire leaves. What do you see?
Remnants of trees. You see the carcasses of what was previously.
You see the carcass. Well, yeah. It's better than the carcass because the trunk of the tree didn't burn.
Yeah.
What the hell happened to? Wait a minute, the tree didn't burn? No, the leaves burned and the branches burned, the overstory burned, but the tree itself is still standing.
Is it because of the bark typically, right?
Well, no, it's because of the density of the carbon.
Really?
It's not going to let oxygen into it enough to keep the combustion going. So there's a building in Minneapolis called the T3 building. Yeah, I would hopefully encourage you to share that with your listeners because the T3 building is a 9-story building. It's made out of cross-laminated timber. It was designed by Michael Green, who's an architect in Seattle, by the way. You might want to get him on next.
Yeah, no, I absolutely will. Yeah.
He's fantastic. He's given TED Talks and all that other stuff. So you make a building out of cross-laminated timber. Well, what is cross-laminated timber? So what Michael Green did was he took all of the pine trees that were killed off by the blister bark beetle.
Yeah.
And they look just like a fire had gone through there, basically.
Yeah,
and
they wipe out.
And from those, he made cross-laminated timber, CLT.
Wow.
And then he built the T3 building out of it. It sequestered 3,646 tons of carbon.
Wow.
Okay.
And for all the development happening across the world, like one of the largest, actually, I don't quite know if it's one of the largest sources of carbon and gases right now, but certainly a non-minuscule portion of these gases are coming from developing countries building new structures, right?
No,
and building new, huh?
So I said no joke. And to make steel, you have to dig up a whole bunch of iron oxide from the ground, and then you have to bring it to a smelter, and then you have to drive off all the poisonous gases, and then you have to actually pickle it. So when you make an ingot of steel, it's actually pig iron. You have to submerge that in liquid 100% concentrated sulfuric acid.
I had no idea.
Out the smokestack goes the fumes from that. And this thing is red hot. And what it does is it actually eats off all of the little spicules in the mold that they poured the iron into so that you can actually handle it. That's just one little feature of making iron. Okay, so iron, steel, and then, of course, to make glass, you have to superheat it up, right? And you've got to get the electricity from someplace. So
Which is
usually going to
primarily coal.
coal power plants or natural gas power. Well, the
Sometimes
point
hydro.
is, they're just the carbon footprint of a glass, concrete, and steel building is ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like it.
The carbon footprint of a CLT building
Mm.
that harvests rainwater, that has a built-in vertical farm unit, that has glass that's clear, but it's also photovoltaic, because you can
Wow,
make
yeah.
glass that's clear with photovoltaic coating. So you can now capture energy, you can capture water, you can generate food. Guess what else does that? A tree.
You're just building man-made trees, essentially.
Correct.
Wow, that's
Correct. Now,
fascinating.
every building will have all of those characteristics.
Mm.
New York City, 100 years ago to today, if you look at how many buildings are still standing regarding how many were put up at 1900,
Mm-hmm.
the answer is less than 20%. So in 120 years, if we'd elected to do this in 1900, by the year 2020, we would have had converted 80% of the buildings to carbon positive rather than carbon negative footprints. What
Yeah.
if we started that today? Well, in another 120 years, which is beyond your lifespan, it's beyond my lifespan, but it's still short term, very short term. If you consider
Mm.
how long it took us to do all of this crap to this planet, it took 12,000 years. All right, so we don't have 12,000 years to correct this. So
No.
I'm saying that vertical farming is an integral part of every single building. Rain harvesting is part of every single building. Cross laminated timber is part of every single building. It's all going to happen because it should, and
Mm-hmm.
it could happen, and therefore it will happen. The pressure, forget politics, forget investment, forget all this. People will do it because they know it's the right thing to do.
You
Now
think so?
imagine living in an apartment complex. You said that food should be a communal activity. Well, it would be in an apartment complex that I imagine, because here's this cross-laminated timber apartment complex where every apartment is growing some kind of food.
Surely.
There's a growing association. I don't know how to do this. I don't know. No, it's okay. We'll take care of it for you. And the excess goes downstairs into the greengrocer.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of it gets redistributed throughout the building, so every cuisine gets what it needs, and everybody's happy, and they're all doing it because they know it's the right thing to do. Their food at that moment is off the grid. It's free.
Well, I think it's important not to understate the importance of that politics as well as, social tendencies actually play into this. I think that once you have a community that's oriented around doing this specific activity, it creates a
Yep.
precedent for the individual to then be engaged with their community, right? And
No,
I think
no
if
question.
there's one thing that we have gone severely wrong in the current model of society we have right now and have had for a very long time now, actually, that I take that back, maybe 100 years, right? Is the death of community, right? With the death of formal religion, in large part, not totally, but in large part, a lot of people around the world. I know America's a little bit peculiar in this sense because we still have, a majority of religious folks, but in other countries, we're looking at 70-80% of the population are atheists, right? And that's great when it comes to aligning oneself with science and other things like
No,
that.
you're right. You're right.
But the unfortunate thing is there's a death of community. There's a death of meaning there. And I think that one of the only ways we can really, as individuals, overcome our peculiar place right now in the 21st century is through having more community orientation and more of an incentive personally to try to foster our own sense of meaning in conjunction with what communities we surround ourselves in or
I
with.
I could not agree more with you, and you're accused of being a socialist, and I would be too. But there are other levels of life that exceed the minimum good.
Yeah.
That if you want to be rich, that's fine. You want to be a Bill Gates Jr., that's absolutely okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Don't
Yeah.
deprive the people at the bottom of that pyramid the essentials to live a normal life. You're
Absolutely.
living an abnormal life. but I would live a normal life and I would be very happy. There's plenty of room for creativity. There's plenty of free time. There's plenty of sharing. There's lots of solidarity. The solidarity of the DNA molecule is highly underrated. I mean, your body is mostly other animals' DNA, not yours. If you look at how many microbes you have on you and in you, you've got about 3 trillion more organisms living in you with DNAs that have nothing in common with yours whatsoever than you have cells with your own DNA in them. But you live as a community. You live as a whole unit, and without them, you would be challenged to make it to the next day. Well, so now you know the way life really behaves. Life does behave like a community, and it's an assemblage of collaborative organisms working towards a common good, and that is that it's their own survival.
Which is fascinating because you keep talking about like systems, right? And understanding specific systems and systems of organisms. And one of the things that's most striking about not only what biology has taught us, but about what a lot of the fruits of modern science have told us is most of everything is a system in some way, right? If the universe naturally goes towards entropy, the one exception to that is life, and that is an incredible fact. Like seldomly do we actually reflect on how weird that is. For a universe that is constantly in a state of decay, the one thing that grows is life. Of course it dies, but then it's reborn. And that element, that central narrative of the human existence, is also the central element of everything that's alive, as well as everything that makes us up as individuals. The way that ideas work is they're interconnected systems, right? The way that our bodies work, as you're saying, are interconnected systems. Society is an interconnected system. And it seems completely irrespective of that fact to not have communities that have that at their heart, right? That it's totally irrespective of.
Well, we have another participant. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
But oh, that's totally okay.
No, have a seat. Come on. Just say hello. Say hello.
Have you had dinner yet?
No, I haven't. Say hello.
Hi.
I'm eating.
Okay, see you later. No, I haven't, but I will. It's my grandson, Ivan.
Oh, how old is he?
He's 4.5, going on 12.
Aw.
November 10th, 5, he says.
Wow, that's pretty sweet.
No, he's one of our bright spots in our life right now. And, his future, that's not a bad segue, actually. And I'm sorry that I interrupted your philosophy.
No, it's okay. No, please go on.
But look, everybody knows what the right thing to do is. Mm-hmm. Intrinsically, we know what the right thing to do is. We are led astray by these diversions, like an anomaly, like, someone wins the lottery or somebody... Time out.
I have to pee and I can't reach.
Ivan.
And I guess I would. And I thought I'd do it, and now I'm back, but now I'll do
it. Okay.
It's all good.
Oh, so we don't have him that often, but when we do, we dote on him all over the place. So he's the future. He's the one person I can look to and say, I hope that some of this happens within your lifetime.
Yeah.
Because when it does, and you're absolutely right, it's like a chain reaction.
Mm-hmm.
You 2 and then 4 and then 8 and 16 and 32. And it's not just viral. It's like, why can't I live like that? All you need is one good example. And you've got
exactly.
examples. And then you've got 20, and then you've got a whole city like that. And I used to think of Portland like that, but I don't anymore. I don't. I actually don't.
But that's quite understandable.
There are some places in the world, and I've had the privilege of traveling to places like Bhutan and some other places where money is not the object because they don't really believe in money. They just believe in living the good life. And that good life is simple and direct. And it means you have enough to eat, and it means you have a place to live, and it means you have relatives, and it means you have a way of expressing yourself.
There's some source of joy in every day, right? It includes,
exactly.
Perhaps not the religious, but there are forms of almost religious rituals, right? Whether it's ritualistic,
absolutely.
the family, or sort of communal, like larger gatherings. And I think that's one thing that I when I was younger, I did a lot of rowing and sailing, so we'd go over to different countries and compete with that, right? And one of the things that stood out to me specifically about Ireland is they have a lot more embedded culture of like going out with friends and like actually enjoying it.
This is true.
Whereas in the US there's something about sort of the yuppie mindset, the workaholic mindset of the US that's that's intoxicating, right?
Funny you should mention Ireland. That's where I originated from. My grandmother was from Ireland.
Really? That's
New Orleans when I went back in the turn of the century, and she was part of the potato famine movement. So
yeah. Which is a perfect example of man-made structures interacting with parasitic situations, creating disaster, right? It's potato famine or the hi Ivan.
Say hello. We're almost done.
The potato famine is oftentimes known as the potato genocide for those exact reasons. I was going to ask you quickly about the I don't know if you've ever heard of Masdar City. I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's in the UAE.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's Abu Dhabi.
Yeah. What do you make of that city?
Failure.
You think so?
I think it is because, at least the part that I was familiar with, they were actually selling shares of that city to investors.
Yeah, exactly.
To come in and to become part of this carbon neutral city.
That's why.
And I think the model was not a good model.
Yeah, I feel like that's one.
They had the money to do it all themselves if they really wanted to.
No, absolutely. Which I think is going to be one of the largest difficulties in when it comes to actually building a better tomorrow is the current system, the current way that things work is a lot of it's driven by free market investments, right? So you have to have economically advantageous solutions, which is one of the reasons why like carbon sequestration hasn't been able to actually get as much investment as
exactly.
And so there are these very obvious, blatant solutions that are becoming. Obviously they're complex and they require a lot of research, but nonetheless they are not being investigated as thoroughly as they could be.
You're right. Absolutely. I think not enough people have the advantage of taking full advantage of the carbon credits to say that I can actually make a living instead of maybe growing corn. I think I'll grow trees. If you grew trees, you'd get a lot more return on your investment in about 10 years than you would ever gotten with corn. But it's short-term versus long-term goals, right? So
absolutely.
Not good at long-term goals.
We are terrible at long-term goals.
We are.
Something that
is like 20 years. That's not a long-term, basically. But
true. That's absolutely true.
It's too bad.
Are you doing okay on time currently, or should we move on to the rapid-fire questions?
If you can allow me just one moment, Ivan, you have to leave now, but you can come back in when I finish, okay?
Why leave?
Thank you. I'll tell you when, okay? Okay, you can stay right there. So it's up to you. This is your show. I'll do whatever you'd like.
Yeah, no, I would love to keep talking. This is a lot of fun. I think we're on a very similar wavelength.
Sessions, because I think the vision of the future in which you incorporate into the built environment all of the things that already exist in nature, that's biomimicry at a very grand scale. And that's what I'm advocating, basically. If you look at a forest, it doesn't have to be a hardwood forest, but hardwood forests behave a little bit more socially than tropical forests. In the tropics, the trees are independent of each other. As soon as there's a canopy breach, when a tree falls down, there's a competition for that space, right? That's not what happens with hardwood forests and with pine forests in the temperate zone. Are you familiar with a book called Overstory?
No, I've heard of it though.
Oh, it's a fabulous book, and it's the whole book is a tour de force of understanding the way forests work. The whole book is predicated on that one principle. And the understory, of course, is what happens underneath the trees. Pardon me. I mean, the overstory are the trees themselves. So if you look at the way trees behave, they're extremely social. They share resources. They distribute water through their root systems, and they're connected by mycelia for nutrition as well. They are absolutely the quintessential ecosystem maintainer. Okay? And they have wonderful built-in mechanisms for repair and for growth and for maintaining status quo. They do not exceed their limits with regards to resources. How could they? It's impossible. We do that all the time. But we don't have to do that all the time. If we took our lessons basically from nature, then the tree is the best example I can think of. It's been around a long, long time. It survived a meteor 65 million years ago. Trees were present almost 100,000 years after that happened. I mean, the earth was scorched, but the seeds survived, and they replenished the soil, and they rebuilt this entire planet. And before we started to chop them down, there were 6 trillion trees. And today there are 3 trillion trees. That's half of the Earth's ability to sequester carbon has been just wiped out. We just did that without even knowing what we were doing. It's gone. So now that we know, we have no excuse for not reversing what's gone on before. So that creates a big problem, though, because FAO says we know what the forests are all about, and we know what the food production is all about, and we know that we really are cutting down too many trees, and we're replacing them with farms that don't contribute to carbon sequestration.
Absolutely, and they also deplete the soils.
Because the population continues to grow. We have to feed them. How the hell are we going to manage all this? And here's the answer. That's what I think. Here's
vertical farming.
I don't think not just vertical farms, urban agriculture. If half of us decide to live in cities, let's feed those people from within the city. Let's not rely on anything on the outside. If we could do that, and we can do that, then this takes huge pressure off of the land. It allows a lot of those farms to grow back into forests.
Moving to a slightly more contentious, where do you view veganism or vegetarianism as fitting into this? Because obviously it's, I'm a meat eater. Ethically, I understand it's dubious, and I'll probably be shunned by future generations of humanity, hopefully.
Be with you, unfortunately.
But it seems like urban agriculture, one of the main flaws there is, apart from maybe poultry production, I don't really see very much room for meat production still there, unless we have growing of meat like in lab settings, which I know is starting to happen more.
It's true, but I mean, I think that if you can include fish, mollusks, crustaceans,
lots
poultry,
of trout.
I mean, come on, anything with 4 legs is off the charts over here.
Some bugs.
I'd say, don't eat that, but feel free to eat chickens and other manageable crops, which are simple to control, easy to grow, and everybody eats them.
Because I think one of my primary concerns right now, if I were to do a short list of the main risks that I'm interested in, because I think they're just posing massive threats to our society that we don't really have ways currently to overcome fully, ocean acidification would be one. And I think the reason why ocean acidification, in addition to
that's a big problem,
is Southeast Asia has if you draw a circle around India and China, there's more people living in that circle than outside of it. And this creates a situation where Indonesia, South China, Southern India, these places subsist very largely. Their protein reserves very largely are based in the South Asian Sea, right? And this creates a situation where, because of ocean acidification and the dying off of coral reefs, the main ways that these fish populations maintain themselves are slowly eroding away. So there's going to be a massive need for protein. There's going to be a massive need for protein, because I can see us growing rice indoors. I know there's a Japanese company that grows rice in its lobby, and I know that there's there's plenty of leafy green solutions, and you can grow tomatoes and more nefarious plants with vertical farms. But you can't. It doesn't strike me that there's enough high protein foods that you can grow with vertical farming systems, that you need to have either aquatic systems for fish, which I know you could probably have a vertical farm system that's integrated with a fish farm. Does that look like a potential solution, this larger issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are lots of ways of solving the protein problem.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, a lot of plants have very rich protein sources also, but you have to mix and match in order to get it right. Rice and beans, for instance, is a wonderful combination because it contains all the essential amino acids that you need in order to live. So you find the cultures that have rice and beans as the staple, and then you add a little chicken or a little fish or a little shrimp or something else, and you've got a complete meal. That's possible to do now. I mean, I think that we create these situations where we think that if we eliminate all of the animal products from our diet, that everybody's going to die. But that's not going to happen. I mean, I think half of that country lives without any meat whatsoever.
Yeah, that's true.
They're vegans. They're real veggies, as they call them. But there's so many different vegetables that they're throwing at you, and they all taste great, and they're all wonderful to grow. And so the next thing you know, they're living the same as the people in the other upper half of India. There's no difference between South India and Northern India with regards to the health of the people. And so it's got to be something other than where you get your nutrition from, as long as you get what you need.
What a fantastic lie from big meat production and as well as like big milk. That's
of course.
I know it gets into like what the the Food and Drug Administration recommended, as a way to artificially increase the consumption of milk.
It's just a way of hyping an industry that needs help. I mean, all those cattle wars and everything else that were going on, that's all part of our Western history. It's glorified. Where the hell did cattle come from anyway? No idea where those animals came from, but they certainly weren't part of the migratory route that buffalo used to take up and down the North American continent. And if you want to eat meat, eat a buffalo. Let's bring them back.
Let's bring all the buffalo back.
Bring all the buffalo back.
That's my biggest takeaway from this conversation is bring the buffalo back.
Where you are, just knock the dams down and let the salmon come back.
Yeah, which is the biggest issue is America is so disgruntled currently with nuclear energy, which is understandable. The military had a big part in making some really inefficient nuclear production. But that kind of created a situation where hydrothermal power was one of the possible solutions, and now we're really reaping some detriments from that.
That's true.
Yeah.
Plus, a lot of those dams are not necessary now anyway, and we've found that out. In fact, when you go to the east, they were all used to make grist mills and to run the millinery mills to make the cloth that we stole, of course, from England. The Civil War. Let's go right back to the origins of all this. If it's not about money, it's not about anything. Period. So right now, that's the threat. That if there is a threat for the vertical farm or urban agriculture, for people starting to do it on their own, it's that it threatens a food system that's already broken.
Yeah, that's true.
And the climate change issue of where your food comes from makes life so complex in terms of imports and exports and trades, and it's beyond the human condition to be able to handle all of that. So there's a lot of have-nots and haves with regards to even plain vegetables. I mean, if you were to just eat vegetables and be a vegan through and through, no milk products, no egg products, just vegetables. Getting enough of the proper vegetables every day is a big deal.
Yeah.
And crop failures occur throughout the world. People go on strike. There's civil war. There's all kinds of stuff going on that interrupts the flow of those items to your plate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Why not just have it coming from next door rather than from Asia?
And because it seems like there's really what vertical farming and what you're vying for here is a simplification of food production, right? Yeah, which is such an obvious solution, right? Because I think with globalism, we've seen this sort of increase in complexity, right? To talk about the antithesis of entropy, look at how the world's become so hyper connected, and that's been great in a lot of ways. But it's also meant that viruses can infect the world. But I think that when it comes to food production specifically, it makes so much more sense to have it centralized in little pockets, right?
No question. And you can have what you want. I mean, you can.
Yeah.
Every culture is different. Every demand. You've got about 80 standard vegetables that if you grew only those, you could still have 90% of the cuisines of the world. You know, if you eliminate garlic, forget about it. You eliminate potatoes and tomatoes, forget about it. You eliminate hot peppers, forget about it. The next thing you know, you've got nothing. So you just throw those 4 things back into the equation, and you've got about 10 major cuisines that you can supply food for that people will be very happy with.
So, I had no idea it was that.
Oh, yeah. So that was one of our classes that we had on those 10 years of brainstorming this thing. What are the 80 essential vegetables that every culture uses? And, you know, when you start talking about potatoes, they come from Peru. Don't give me that stuff about, you know, that's there because of the Spanish conquistadores. And everybody hated those people, right? So, but they didn't mind it when they brought the potato back. And now you've got potatoes as part of the Chinese cuisine, for God's sakes. You've also got rice as part of the Italian cuisine.
Yeah.
You've got, you know, so you've got an international food supply. It's basically, we have X amount of starch for energy, and the rest is for micronutrients and growth.
Yeah.
And any way you want to mix that is fine with me. And so you can there isn't one thing you can't raise indoors. Not one thing. Go to the latest botanical garden, and you can see all those exotic plants from all over the world being grown to confluence. It may cost you a little bit more to grow some of them, but in the long run, you don't need all of them. You just need about 80.
And a lot of that production, I feel like I think one of the reasons why I'm so struck by vertical farming, in addition to like the prospects for how it can change our society and personal ways that I could get involved that I'm interested in, it seems like fundamentally you're going against it's something totally new in human production, because, you know, when we first settle down growing foods, that food naturally, you know, there's a connection between private property, whether it's food or other material goods, and sort of the growth of wealth, right? The growth of wealthy individuals. So you saw these original human societies, exactly, right? The creation of money. So a lot of like product through history, like the first writing systems were so the wealthy kings and magistrates could like count how many sheep and how much wheat and how much grain they had. You know, so we see this very strong tendency in human society to have food production serve, you know, the powerful up the chart, right? And then with vertical farming, it does the exact opposite. It takes food as the basis of those power structures and then makes it so the people are actually the ones who are producing the food for themselves, right? It's not feeding a larger, you know, system. Obviously, there are still going to be some people who aren't interested at all in farming and are just going to, you know, get food from whatever sources they have in their local community, but nonetheless, the locus to food production will still be, you know, the people, and it's going to serve a different end than it has historically, which I just think is super fascinating.
Well, I would say that at this moment that is not the case, because I don't know any vertical farms that are not privately owned. I don't know any communal vertical, but I think the trend is towards that. A communal garden that's indoors. Okay, you farm all year long then, and there's no need to go without food.
And all day and night too.
And at night, I mean, come on, 24/7. It's been around a long time, you're right. And since the 1960s, we've known how to do all of this except for the LED lights.
Wow.
All of the other steps, hydroponics, all that stuff, that was all well worked out back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And now we've been sitting on this because there hasn't been a real need to do it.
And now climate change.
Climate change is that's the game changer. And we did that. And we did that actually by creating more farmland.
Yeah, exactly. Which is really ironic, actually.
Exactly. Well, you know what? It's like self-fulfilling prophecy.
It is, absolutely, yeah.
Realize what's going on. But before we could actually look to see what we were doing by using satellites to photograph the Earth every 4 hours, and to then look at those photographs and to just say how much farmland there really is versus how much they say there is. You know, we farm the size of South America.
Yeah, that's what I saw in one of your talks. Insane. And something else that's really striking is how quickly we're depleting the topsoil, right? It takes 1,000 years for 2 centimeters of topsoil to get placed. Right. And we aren't supplying, and I know that there's certain agricultural techniques you can use where you have pasture land that you then grow food on, and then you have pasture land. You sort of are able to artificially increase
crops. That's true.
crop rotation. But monoculture, as you talked about a little bit earlier, is the standard right now,
Correct.
And that without a doubt in my mind is one of the one of the scariest things, frankly. Is how are we going to overcome this massive impending issue of crops not growing anymore? And when we have to have the systems in place before that happens, before we emerge at that point.
No joke.
And perhaps climate change will be the vector of that change before it is so necessary that we die. We will have a transitory period that might just be just long enough for us to fundamentally change our food production and the systems around that. Because otherwise, we're going to be thrown into the den, the wolves' den, and get absolutely torn up by the fact that we can't produce enough food from crop failures.
Well, let's go back to when we didn't know what causes diseases.
Exactly.
Okay, so we had religious ceremonies and quarantining people to keep them away from the evil spirits, and I don't know if you're a big fan of American literature, but I used to be. And Henry James wrote a wonderful novel called, and I'm going to block on this, and it's so stupid that I'm blocking on this right now, but you're going to edit this, I hope. I hope. Oh, come on. The name of this is Daisy Miller. Okay, so Daisy Miller was an American woman whose relatives lived in Italy. And they were told when she got there that the one thing they didn't want her to do was to go out roaming around in the Roman Colosseum at night. The proper women just don't do that. And of course, she wasn't a proper woman. She was an American. She could do whatever she goddamn wanted. So one night, of course, unbeknownst to her relatives, she snuck out. And just because they said, don't do it, she wanted to do it. So what do you suppose was the reason why they said that? And it wasn't because of any social context. It wasn't because they would be scandalized by the fact that we saw your niece out in the... No, it wasn't that at all. It was the fact that Daisy Miller ended up dying from malaria.
Wow.
She caught it roaming around the grounds of the Roman Colosseum that had stagnant pools of water that mosquitoes would breed in, and this was the turn of the century, and malaria was all over the place. Pardon me. And that was the reason. So why didn't they just tell her that to begin with? But they didn't actually know what caused malaria.
Yeah. They just had a general
just
aura.
said that if you go out at night, it's actually Latin for bad air. Mal-area.
Wow.
That's what it means. That's the definition of
the miasma, that great narrative.
So plague was like that. Flu was like that. Until the germ theory actually got established, right? And cholera, all those horrible diseases, the yellow fever, all of them, they had to be discovered. And once they were discovered, there were simple solutions. Like, for instance, the Panama Canal was absolutely devastated by yellow fever. They had no idea what caused it. And in fact, what they found out was that it was a mosquito-borne infection. And they found that out in Cuba. They didn't find that out in Central America. They found that out in Cuba.
Wait, really? What the heck?
Yeah, they did. They conducted experiments on people. And they found out that certain mosquitoes will transmit yellow fever. And so what they did, and it was a specific kind of mosquito. It wasn't the kind that transmits malaria. This mosquito breeds in temporary bodies of water. Mosquitoes that transmit malaria breed in permanent bodies of water. So if you're working on the Panama Canal and you've got all these puddles hanging around, just get rid of the puddles and you won't have any more yellow fever. You don't have to have a vaccine or a drug or anything else. You just have to get rid of the vector. So those are simple solutions to complex problems. Well, we've got a complex problem right now. That's climate change, right? So there are simple solutions to climate change. If their food won't grow outdoors, oh, I see. Then we should grow it indoors. Oh, and then once you start doing that, and you don't need to grow your food outdoors anymore, well, then you just abandon the land. Then what happens next? It rewilds. Then what happens next?
Carbon.
Then the temperature starts to drop again. Then the carbon sequestration starts to come. What the?
And then, meanwhile, you're trying to
frustrated with these simple solutions.
And the issue is
executing them is difficult.
Yeah,
but
exactly, right?
Do is simple. So that's the problem of convincing people that it's worth doing this, not for you, not for the next generation, but for the one after that.
I have a theory on how we can do that.
Oh, I would love
And
to hear that.
this is the central one of the central tenets of something I've been working on for the last few months. It's inspired from. Are you familiar with the work of Viktor Frankl? He was an existential psychologist.
Yeah, no, I know the name.
So logotherapy is his theory of meaning, that meaning drives people's actions. Debunked in some capacity, but I absolutely believe it's true, right? The most meaningful activities you can, excuse me, some of the most deep motivation people can actually get in life at all is from activities that they feel are meaningful, right? We have this weird tendency towards meaning. Which is one of the reasons why a lot of modern jobs are very damaging to people's psychology.
This is all true.
And I believe that one of the ways that we can start to overcome these really major societal threats, and more specifically actually implement the solutions that we have to them, because we need so much work to be done, right? It's approaching climate change with solutions isn't just going to be done in one sector of the economy or one area of life. It's going to be a philosophical, political, economic, technological. It has. Essentially, it's the product of our collective society, and because that requires people working in all aspects of our collective society, except maybe the oil industry, to actually bring solutions that are going to work, right? Yeah. And I feel like the only way we can have that myriad, that massive amount of people on different areas and in different sectors working is if we can find a way to get individuals super passionate about cultivating their own sense of meaning in conjunction with solving very specific aspects of climate change. And the issue there, the difficulty there is saying that, okay, I'm an individual. I'm willing to dedicate my education to learning a very specific aspect of climate change and potential solutions, right? But I do that, and I don't have the good faith that enough other people are doing that my work will actually mean anything, right? Because the issue with climate change is, in a lot of ways, it's not fully a zero-sum game, but there is a certain point that if we don't meet a certain threshold, it will be catastrophic for society. So why should I dedicate my life and my meaning to this thing that might just end up killing us anyways, right? And the question there is, recognizing that the struggle against the plight of climate change is still meaningful, even if it's not successful in the end. Even if it does eventually succumb, if we eventually succumb to the forces of climate change and other disasters, striving against those and fighting against those, whether it's in community, politics, economics, or any other ways that people can decide to take action against it, that is still personally meaningful and has the potential, if people focus and actively work to cultivate that pursuit in their life, because it's something you have to strive after. You have to pursue it day in day. Maybe then we can get just enough people to actually allow us to turn the tide. Maybe if we can teach people to take the absence of meaning that our society is throwing upon the 21st century individual, maybe if we can remind them that meaning is important and you can get it through working against these massive global issues, maybe that will actually be a solution.
Those are my sentiments exactly. And if you get the author of the Overstory on your podcast, his name is Richard Powers, he will tell you that was the reason why he wrote the book.
Really?
If you read this book, you will hear your own words echoed throughout that book.
That's fantastic.
I am not joking.
Wow,
what you just said is the essence of a 500 and some odd page book.
That's wonderful to know.
With 6 different people's stories integrated in weird ways, but it's all about trees, climate change, and changing the course. That's all it's about. And it says it's possible to do this. It is. Somebody in the story will say something like, it doesn't really matter what happens. They could burn it all down. They could make farms out of all of it. The moment that collapses, people will start doing the right thing. So you need a catastrophic event or events in order to polarize people in the right direction. And Japan, by the way, if you're looking for events like that in vertical farming, it's easy to find them in The tsunami following the earthquake that was in 2011 for Tokyo and for all of the east coast of Japan, Sendai was the epicenter. Once that happened, Japan in 1 hour lost 5% of its farmland. That
Wow.
doesn't sound like a lot, but it's an enormous amount of farmland. And
Yeah.
that placed an enormous pressure on the food system of Japan to feed all of these well-educated people who knew that once the Daiichi nuclear power plant blew up, they weren't going to eat anything coming from that area.
Yeah.
Nothing. Okay? So the Japanese government essentially nationalized with money, lots of money, that always works, industries to get behind vertical farming.
Really? I didn't realize that was.
No, it's
That's
vertical
so
farming
fascinating.
in Japan that solved the big problem because people would eat food if they knew exactly where it came from.
Yeah. Because
They
there's
knew it
this.
didn't glow in the dark, and it was healthy for them. And now they've got literally hundreds of vertical farms throughout Japan. They've got Mitsubishi working on this. They've got lots of universities working on it.
Have you been able to travel and view these farms firsthand, or are you in
Some of them
contact?
I have. Yeah, I'm not there, but in Singapore and other places, I have seen them.
Mhm.
And for Singapore, it was for a different reason that they were doing it. But Japan is a poster child for a catastrophic event that all of a sudden everybody expected Godzilla to emerge out of the sea and destroy the entire country, right? Because that's the way the movie said that was going to end. And Godzilla wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for the nuclear, all that stuff, right? So there's a mythology behind a lot of the belief that technology is good and technology is bad. Technology killed off Godzilla. They actually got rid of it. But then they stopped using nuclear power as well. Okay, so fine. So Japan has switched to something called plasma arc gasification. Excuse me, it's a high energy incineration process that takes essentially garbage and it vaporizes it.
Wow.
It actually breaks all the chemical bonds in anything.
Does it release gases that are harmful to the environment?
But you can trap the gases and recycle them and create something called syngas out of it, which is equivalent to methane.
Oh, wow.
You burn methane, of course you get water, you get heat, and you get CO2. Now, what are you going to do with the CO2? Well, that's a problem, all right? And that's a problem that we haven't yet to deal with on an industrial level.
Yeah.
I know that there are ways of handling it. You can trap it all and turn it back into limestone if that's what you want to do. So
it's very energy intensive.
Yes, yes, but that's only a matter of time before it's not. What if you did that all by, let's say, renewable energy resources? What if you lived in Iceland? You could recycle every carbon atom you ever wanted and more.
Yeah, because of the geothermal.
Using geothermal. So if you look around the world where these examples should exist as shining lights of, I wish we could do that. Oh, yes, we can, because we can harness the wind, or we can harness the tides, or we can do something in order to get on board with the same mindset. So in the long run, that's what's going to happen.
And I reckon that the one of the big challenges of actually being able to have these solutions come into the public knowledge and actually start getting done globally, especially here in the United States, is communicating those stories. It's talking to those people, and it's being able to lecture and talk about these, preach these things, and that's exactly what you're doing, and that's
that's what we're doing. You're doing this too. You are inviting people that have points of views that offer solutions rather than problems.
Exactly.
I don't want to listen to the problems anymore. I already know what they are. I want to solve some of these problems. And
exactly.
I'm sure you believe this as well as I do. You solve one of those problems and you've solved them all.
Yeah. Yeah.
You start the train. That solved makes life so much better for everybody. Oh, Jesus, now we can do this, and now we can do that, now we can do this. The next thing you know, you've got a totally different civilization, basically.
Yeah, when the goal of a group of people cooperating is actually providing solutions that impact the wellness of people, when the goal is to increase wellness and not increase the amount of money in your pocket, it changes how groups of people interact with reality and changes how a group of people cooperate, right?
Right.
it takes I mean, it makes it a lot easier for cooperation to actually happen, because instead of it being, all right,
True.
well, I heard so-and-so is making more money than me in this project, it reorients it towards, we're having this collective impact.
Do you know, in the United States during the Second World War, before we entered the Second World War, we were a country that was driven by industries, right?
Mhm.
The automotive industry, the power industries, all these industries, and they were all separate from each other, and they were not connected, and they were not cooperative.
Mhm.
And then World War II occurred. The next thing you know, the president of the United States and his cabinet had the power to nationalize those industries and to get them to stop making automobiles and to start making airplanes and tanks and everything else. And so that's the way you do it. I mean, you just put the machine to a different task.
To a
So
different angle, yeah.
we're now sitting on a time bomb with regards to vaccine development.
Yeah, talk
So
about it.
vaccines are developed by companies that expect to make a lot of money from them.
Mhm. Yeah.
And a lot of them do. And by the way, did you get your flu shot yet?
Not yet. I'm gonna get
Me
next
neither.
week.
But if you do, you don't have to put your wallet, you get it for free, right?
Mhm.
So why is that? Why do we get flu shots for free?
Well, I
Who
mean,
pays
public.
for it? Who pays for that? Somebody had to make the flu vaccine.
Yeah.
And we know the companies that make the flu vaccine, and they are subsidized by the government to make the flu vaccine so that we don't have to pay, so that everybody doesn't have an excuse for not being able to afford to be vaccinated. Because if you get flu, you can give it to somebody else.
Yeah, it's a public deficit.
Now, Northeastern University just dismissed 11
Yeah,
students.
I saw that.
They're gone. They have no way of coming back to that school. They are dismissed. They're expelled. They disobeyed a cardinal rule. The cardinal rule was, you have to think in terms of the large majority of people in that campus. If you go out and break the rules, you're going to screw it up for everybody.
Yeah.
You can't do that. Were you a student at that school? How did you ever get in? Let me see your SAT scores. I can't believe the arrogance of some people. Youth has nothing to do with that, by the way.
You don't think so?
Nothing to do with it. And we're gregarious at a certain age. We need to socialize and everything else. But if somebody says the reason why you're doing this is not because I told you to, but rather because you're going to prevent lives from terminating at a very early age.
Yeah.
If you don't do that, if you obey the rules, everybody is okay. If you disobey the rules, just a few people spoils it for everybody else. So maybe that rule can be applied to, let's say, making food available for everybody, because you know how much money in healthcare you would save by just having proper nutrition.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, and which is because it
It's
seems like the
incredible.
connection between. Sorry, go on.
Coleman, we could go on. Like, how much time have you got? I mean, I do have to eat sometime tonight.
I mean, I'm more than happy to talk for another 30. Honestly, we can split this into 2 parts if you're down.
Oh, I would love to come back.
Or we could record in another session.
No, I would to do another session, because this is part of a much larger picture of why is there a Russia? Why is there a China? Why is there a United States? Why is there that looks like a united Europe, but everybody wants to drop out of the European Union?
Yeah, Brexit really did a number.
To unite different cultures is a difficult thing, only because they believe that whatever they have evolved into is stronger than if they were to relinquish their hold on their culture and share with everybody else. But we have one genome. We have a single human genome, and that genome varies so little between people that, I mean, if you were a white supremacist and I were to show you the DNA sequence of you and somebody from Central Africa, and then show you what the real picture of each of those people look like, I said, you couldn't tell which one was which by the genome. All you could tell is by your own prejudices. To break down that single barrier so that everybody's thinking along the same lines, they use the analogy of a meteor heading towards Earth, and you've got about 10 years to solve the problem.
Yeah.
And everybody has to pitch in together, otherwise the entire Earth suffers. And it turns out, when you look at that meteor heading towards the Earth, it's the Earth.
Yeah, it's just
what
we've done. It's our history.
We are heading towards each other, and we're going to destroy us if we don't band together into a single unit. Now, I don't see everybody behaving the same way like a colony of ants. Everybody has individualities associated with them, and you have to respect those. But there has to be some unifying underlying humanity that. And you were mentioning a philosopher. I mean, I knew the guy that was in charge of a very famous Swiss-based. My mind is not working as well as it used to. Just slower, maybe not the. Oh, come on, name collective unconscious. Who?
Oh, Carl Jung.
Yes, he was. He was in charge of the Jung Institute. His name was Hillman, Hillman, voted one of the top 10 people of all time in history by the University of Chicago. What? I actually got to meet him because I used to fish with his brother.
I like how everything comes back to fishing. This is great.
Or to at least appreciating nature. I mean, that's
true.
You get to appreciate nature, and it has to be intact in order for you to enjoy it. So it can't be, you can't go to the A&P and catch a rainbow trout and think you've been fishing. You have to immerse yourself in the middle of nature in order to appreciate it. That's all.
Well, to bring it back quickly to your point about having to find a way to unify, right? Unify the collective.
By the way, James Hillman.
Okay, James Hillman. I'll write that down. But specifically in the discussion about how do we unify? How do we actually get people behind this fight and push against what is figuratively an asteroid heading towards Earth, with climate change.
Sure.
I think what it comes down to, and this is one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about philosophy, apart from existentialism and questions about ethics, it's how do people work and what unifies action. And I think the thing there is narrative, right? We're a species that operates within narratives. It's why we had to appeal to some sense of God, some story about God for us to be able to deal with the fact of our agriculture sometimes going wrong. We exist in communal narratives, communal stories. So it seems to me that the solution to actually unifying us collectively is coming up with better stories. It's coming up with better narratives about what's going on. And I don't see that happening, right? If we talk about politics briefly, we see specifically the right in the US they're able to craft stories really well, and whereas us on the left, I mean including myself, there's a deficit of storytelling. There's a deficit of effective storytelling, I should say. And I think what that tells to is there is a default need for human cooperation for us to tell good stories. And I think that a big part of this next 10, 15 years in human development is crafting those better stories and getting those stories out there.
Yeah, I would agree. In fact, you'll recall that we needed to allow Pearl Harbor to occur in order to have a good narrative for getting the U.S. involved in war.
Yeah, absolutely.
But once we were on board, everybody wanted to go over and fight. Everybody wanted to because they believed in that cause, and they saw their own lives being threatened. So, if you have to come down to some fundamental like that, I think climate change is the biggest issue I can possibly think of that affects virtually every living thing on the planet.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there are some things that will benefit from climate change. There's no doubt about this. And at one point in Earth's history, it was all tropical.
Yeah.
Really. There were no trout. There were no salmon. There was no cold water or anything. No polar bears. The whole damn thing was so hot, we didn't know what to do with it. So I don't want it to go back to that, obviously. And if I had a choice, I would prefer to
polar bears don't want to.
So I can adjust to all of this. But well, I think that I can talk for a longer time than now, but I would take a break and come back with a more focused opinion about. If you want to hear more about vertical farming, that's fine.
Yeah, no, I would love to talk more about it in another session.
There's a movement. You plant the seeds of that idea, no pun intended, but our class, those 10 years of class time, allowed this idea to mature under the radar screen of virtually everybody. Big Ag, my school, the class before that, the class after that, the class that was in session while I was teaching and allowing them to invent the solutions to the problems that I would pose to them. And I would give them questions and I would say, okay, you guys work on this one, you work on this one, you work on that one. And they came back and in 6 or 8 weeks of independent study, they amazed themselves as to how rigorous they could think. And
how powerful solutions I'm sure they came up with too.
Oh, they did. Oh, trust me on this.
What an inspiring thing to have your students do.
Oh, I I asked them what do they want. They complained. Oh, you have to read the New Yorker story to get the true story on this. But in short, they were very bummed out by hearing that the changing world is going to make them sick at all levels.
Yeah.
Right? Not enough ozone in the atmosphere. Too much ozone at the layer at the surface. Come on, give me a break here. And so they decided, let us work on something that has some meaning to us. And they picked
Mhm.
rooftop gardening.
Yeah.
Rooftop gardening was not the answer either. When they got the answer, they were even more disappointed than they were by listening to me tell them all of the things that are wrong with our environment. So in the end, I turned to them and I said, well, then maybe we ought to take your idea off the roof and move it into the building. That's
Mm.
all I said. I mean, and I said that out of a desperation to just give them some hope. And it turned out to be the right idea. So I don't know.
Well, I think we know what we're going to be talking about next time, planting the
I hope
seeds of vertical farming.
I would,
I'm gonna have you stay on after I end the recording just for some post interview stuff.
sure.
But I thank you so much for
Oh,
coming
my
on.
pleasure.
This has been one of the most enlightening conversations I've had in a very long time. So I really appreciate you being on the show.
Well, that's very kind of you to say that. I feel the
I,
same way, by the way.
and I'm excited. Thank you, and I'm excited to have you back on.
I'd love to.